You know that feeling. Maybe you've been involved in designing a brand new, really cutting-edge tram system for a city. You pour all your energy into it, get it approved, it's a huge success. Fantastic. But then imagine wanting to deploy that exact same system, maybe just, across the border in a neighboring country, and suddenly, wham! You're facing this whole new set of approval hurdles, often feeling pretty redundant, right? Or maybe you're really passionate about railway safety, making sure standards are high everywhere. But you find yourself looking at completely different rule books depending on where you are in Europe. It's complex. And that right there, that's the core challenge we're really digging into today. Public transport systems in Europe, we're talking trams, light rail, metros, they don't have a single standardized way of getting accepted and approved. So what does that actually mean for you working in this field? It means different countries and sometimes even different regions within a country, they all have their own rules, their own regulations, requirements, methods, roles. It's a lot. And trying to compare one approval process directly with another, it's incredibly difficult, causes real bottlenecks.
Yeah, and this fragmentation, it's not just inconvenient red tape. It genuinely hits the bottom line. From an industry perspective, an engineering perspective, it creates massive inefficiencies. Think about it, system providers might lose months, potentially millions, just duplicating safety cases or tests that have already been done and proven elsewhere, which is exactly why the industry is pushing so hard for something called mutual acceptance or cross-acceptance. Basically, the idea that a system, or even just parts of it, approved in one EU country could be readily accepted in another. Now, someone might argue, well, these trams and metros don't usually cross national borders like mainline trains do. And that's true. But the need for efficiency, for a common engineering understanding, that's still absolutely crucial.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a really interesting proposed solution to this. It's a simplified, generic approval process designed specifically for these public transport systems. We're going to explore the findings from a big European project that set out to do just this. They meticulously analyzed all the existing processes, looked for the common ground, and came up with a standardized framework, a framework that could genuinely revolutionize how these systems get developed and rolled out across the continent. So let's get into it. Okay, so let's kick things off by getting a clearer picture of the current landscape. We mentioned different rules, but let's break that down. It's not just small variations we're talking about. There's essentially no single set of standardized safety requirements for public transport systems across Europe, which means every member state uses its own criteria to decide if something is safe enough. It really is a patchwork quilt, so fragmented that even within one country, like Germany, for instance, you can find variations because of how federal responsibilities are split.
It really is quite something. But what's interesting, despite this fragmentation, is that we are seeing more and more modern public transport projects adopting European standards. Things like EN 50126, which is definitely a positive step. It moves things towards harmonization, gives engineers a common technical language. But while it helps a lot, it's not quite the same as having a binding common requirement basis that automatically allows for mutual acceptance across borders. That's the bit that's still missing, and it's what the industry is really advocating for to unlock those efficiencies we talked about.
That makes total sense. Okay, before we jump into the proposed solution, maybe it's helpful to quickly define the key players involved. Who are the essential roles in getting one of these systems approved?
Right, good idea. Well, first off, you always have the owner. That's the entity that actually, owns the system. Could be a city, a municipality, maybe even a private company. Then, closely linked, is the operator. They're the ones running the system day to day, managing the staff, the operational rules, all that. And sometimes the owner and operator are the same entity. Sometimes they're separate. Then you've got the assessor. Think of them as the independent expert. They need to be qualified, recognized by the approval authority, and their job is to objectively check if safety requirements and sometimes other things like availability are actually met. And the final piece of that puzzle is the approval authority. This is the official state body. They're the ones who issue the actual operating license or permit, and they also supervise the system once it's running. And when we talk about the end of a project, there are a couple of key terms. There's acceptance. This is basically the customer, the owner or operator formally saying, yes, this new system meets all the specifications we agreed on in the contract. It's their sign-off. Then, more specifically, you have safety acceptance. This focuses purely on the safety side. It's accepting the documented proof that all the safety requirements are met and the safety functions work correctly, often validated by an assessor or the authority itself. And the big finale is the approval. That's the ultimate green light. The official permit to operate, granted by the approval authority to the owner and tender or operator.
Okay, that definitely clarifies the players and the terminology, thanks. So Given how complex and fragmented this all is, how did this European project actually go about trying to define a generic approval process? What was their method?
Well, it's a very structured, methodical approach, as you'd expect. The first big step was creating a really comprehensive overview of all the existing approval processes across Europe. And this wasn't just a quick look. They really dug deep, analyzed them meticulously to identify exactly where they were similar and where they differed. That detailed comparison then became the foundation for building this proposed generic process.
And I assume they didn't just guess what those processes were. How did they gather that detailed information? They used structured inquiries, right? Like questionnaires sent out to the member states, asking about everything from the legal basis, the specific regulations, the roles involved, all the way to risk assessment methods, the kind of evidence needed, documentation, acceptance criteria, any, unique national ways of doing things. It sounds really thorough.
Exactly. Very thorough. Standardized questionnaires were key to getting comparable data. And while they gathered info broadly, they did perform really detailed analyses on a few specific countries. I think Germany, France, the UK, Hungary, Denmark, Sweden were on the list. These were chosen for specific reasons, maybe long historical experience, or perhaps they showed some new trends emerging. And crucially, when they analyzed these processes, they mapped them out using flowcharts. But the focus was always on what activities were being done. Not who did them, or exactly when, or how, or even why. Just the core activities. That focus on the what allowed for a much clearer comparison, stripping away some of the national variations in roles or timing.
Right, that makes sense, focusing on the fundamental actions. So despite all the differences they found, what were some of the key similarities that kept popping up? What were the common threads they could weave into this generic process?
Well, surprisingly perhaps, quite a few strong similarities emerged. One big one is what they termed the legislation pyramid. It seems virtually all European countries have a similar hierarchical structure for their laws and regulations in this area. Typically, you start with a main law or act at the top, then come more specific decrees or regulations for public transport. And below that, you find standards, technical rules, maybe application guidelines, and you can also add project-specific requirements from the owner or operator on top of that. Germany's Passenger Transport Act and tramway regulation are good examples, and we're seeing more use of those Senelec railway standards too, like EN 50126.
That pyramid structure sounds logical. What other big commonalities did they find?
Another really fundamental one is the need for state legitimization. Basically, every single process requires an official, state-issued permit to operate the system. No exceptions. And this permit is typically granted by a state-appointed approval authority. Also, while the details vary a lot, the basic idea that there are requirements for the owners, the operators, and the suppliers of systems or subsystems like vehicles or signaling that's universal, and where you have independent assessors involved, their role is usually mandated by those national standards and regulations.
Okay, and you mentioned the Senelec standard EN 50126 earlier. Its life cycle concept seems pretty important here, too. It wasn't originally for trams or metros specifically, was it? But it's being applied more now. Why is that phased approach so key for standardization?
Absolutely. The EN 50126 life cycle concept, yeah, it came from the general railway world, but it's being adopted more and more in public transport projects. And it's crucial because it provides a clear, phased structure. It defines specific activities and the proof you need at each stage. This gives everyone involved a common roadmap, a common language, which massively helps with standardization and comparing different projects. And another point is, no matter how different the processes look on the surface, different scope, number of phases, timing, they all fundamentally follow a step-by-step path towards getting that final operating license. It always starts with the owner's initial idea for the project and always ends with the approval authority issuing the permit. That underlying step-by-step progression is another key similarity. So building on all those common threads, they developed this generic life cycle that has 14 distinct stages. And it assigns those common approval activities to specific phases, while also clarifying who has primary responsibility. So the owner is primarily responsible for the early stages, phases 1 to 4. That covers the initial concept, defining the system and its operating conditions, the risk analysis, and then detailing all the system requirements, technical, procedural, based on risks, standards, project needs, everything. Then the baton passes to the system supplier for phases 5 through 9. This is all about the development and delivery, assigning requirements down to subsystems, the actual design, building it, manufacturing, installation, and finally the system validation and getting that crucial safety acceptance. And lastly, the operator takes the lead for phases 10 to 14. This covers the entire operational life, the day-to-day running and maintenance, monitoring performance, handling modifications or upgrades later on, and eventually decommissioning and disposal at the very end of the line.
And what seems really vital in this generic model is the idea of integrated oversight, isn't it? The assessor isn't just brought in at the end for a final stamp. They work alongside the project, phase by phase, reviewing results as they come in. Continuous safety acceptance, almost. And ideally, the approval authority gets involved early too, maybe approving requirements before the final permit. That feels much more proactive. Okay, let's talk about the nuts and bolts then. These elementary activity modules, what exactly are they? How do they form the building blocks?
All right, the elementary activity modules. Think of them as the smallest common denominators, the basic generic activities you find in all the different approval processes. Even if one country does an activity with more independence or in more detail, or a different person does it, or it happens at a slightly different time, the core activity is often the same. These are those core activities, and they're organized hierarchically following those life cycle phases we just discussed. It starts top down with specification. The overall system concept, definition, risk analysis, those first few phases. And for each major aspect of the overall system, its functions, its safety, there's a recurring pattern of activities. It generally goes: specify the requirements, assess the design against them, provide evidence of compliance through design, testing, etc., assess that evidence, and then finally accept and approve. This top-down specification flows down to the technical subsystems too: rolling stock, track, signaling, power. Each follows a similar pattern within its own mini life cycle. Then, after things are built and installed, phases 6-8, the proof comes back bottom up. Evidence from component testing in the factory, then subsystem testing, first in the factory, then on site, and finally testing the whole integrated system. It all culminates in that independent safety assessment report and the Formal Approval Authority Act issuing the permit.
That really breaks it down well. So, using these modules in the life cycle, who are the main participants involved in this generic process, and how do these modules get assigned?
The key players in this generic view are pretty much the ones we identified earlier. The operator, the system supplier, could be for the whole system or just a part. The independent assessor, often optional but definitely recommended, and the approval authority. You might also have consultants or specific project management organizations involved too, depending on the project. And the framework assigns those elementary activity modules to these participants based on when they typically happen in the life cycle. Now, a participant's responsibility could be legal, defined by law, or contractual, maybe between the operator and supplier, or it could just stem from accepted good engineering practice. What's interesting, though, is that some assessment activities are actually shared. Take assessment of safety requirements or assessment of evidence of compliance for safety. That's not just done by the independent assessor. The supplier does it internally during testing. The operator might do checks focused on operations during trial runs. Even the approval authority might do their own evaluation sometimes, rather than just relying on the assessor's report.
And the same kind of shared assessment often happens for the overall system requirements too, with the operator often very focused on performance aspects.
Okay, so bringing it all back to the real-world issue we started with, we know things aren't uniform now, leading to those inefficiencies when systems need reapproval. How does this generic framework with its common modules actually enable that cross-acceptance you mentioned? How does it help solve the practical problem?
Yes, cross-acceptance. This generic framework is really the key enabler for it. Cross-acceptance is all about streamlining things by reusing approvals. If a piece of equipment, a product, maybe a whole subsystem like signaling, has already been approved or certified somewhere else, perhaps as a generic product, or in a previous specific application verified by an assessor or authority, then cross-acceptance says, okay, let's recognize that previous approval and avoid doing all the same checks again, provided the application conditions are similar enough. It's about leveraging prior work.
And that decision, whether to use cross-acceptance for a component or subsystem, that really needs to happen early, doesn't it? Ideally, right at the beginning of the project, or at least when you start designing, especially if you plan to use pre-approved things like signaling equipment. Making it part of the strategy from the start maximizes the benefit. And you mentioned standards. Can the criteria for accepting these previously approved parts actually come from existing standards?
Yes, absolutely. The decision needs to be made early for maximum impact. And yes, existing standards can often provide the basis for the acceptance criteria, defining what conditions need to be met to allow that reuse of approval evidence. It helps make the process systematic and trustworthy.
Okay, so wrapping things up. We've explored how this generic modular process for accepting and approving public transport systems was developed. It's built on these universal elementary activity modules, clearly defined roles, and it creates a common language. That common language makes things easier to understand, easier to compare, and maybe most importantly, it really opens the door for cross-acceptance to work effectively.
Exactly. And the value here is huge. It's not meant to be a rigid, inflexible straitjacket. It's a framework. That means it's adaptable. You can simplify it for, say, a relatively straightforward tramway extension. Or you can add more layers of detail and rigor if you're dealing with a highly complex driverless underground metro system. That adaptability, combined with the efficiency boost from cross-acceptance, offers really significant improvements, saving time, saving money, and reducing duplicated effort for everyone involved in delivering these vital public transport systems. It's about working smarter.
So let's leave you with a thought. Whether you're an engineering student thinking about the future of cities, an early career professional just starting out in this field, or maybe a seasoned railway safety enthusiast, think about the ripple effects of this kind of standardization. It's not just about cost savings or faster project timelines, important as they are. What wider possibilities open up when we have a more harmonized approach across Europe? Could it accelerate innovation, speed up the adoption of new, safer, greener technologies, make public transport genuinely more accessible and seamless across an entire continent? What role could you play in shaping that future? It's certainly a fascinating prospect to consider, and one that this kind of foundational work helps make possible.